because 6 sessions in, I can finally remember to turn on the recording. So we're going to talk about, like I said, what does it look like if we were to compile data and have it help us predict how these different demographics and culture and backgrounds influence philanthropy. Like the overarching goal here is not to have this, I guess the overarching goal is to really remember that people are still people, regardless of how they identify, where they came from, um, or where they live. Like there's still people that you have to get to know on a personal level to understand their personal motivations. Now, what data does help us do is really predict how we can address them or how we can encourage people to be part of philanthropy. Um, and so I think that's really what it does. So the first section is really going to talk about women versus men, because that is the research out there, right? And so one of the things that isn't as far-fetched now as it was, 5 years ago when I started teaching this class, is looking at women as donors, as women as philanthropists. But there are some things that still exist, is that organizations could do more to engage women, right? Their cultural shifts have led to the emergence of women donors. So more women are in the work field, like workforce, right? More women than ever have degrees. In fact, I think more women than men have degrees these days. There are more leadership roles for women. We recognize that there's still not equality, but because of all of this and the direction that it swung, women have access to money, right? And it's not always like it was in the 1970s, access to their husband's money, right? There are a lot of dual household incomes, and women should be recognized as playing a significant role in philanthropy. So why haven't organizations caught up to that? Well, number one, maybe they just don't have an idea that there are gender differences in philanthropy. There are still those people out there that just business as usual, we're bringing in the money, let's just work that way, right? So organization and cultural leadership. Oftentimes what you're going to see still today is a predominantly male leadership as well as board structure. So sometimes you have to invite those in. You have to invite women to participate at leadership levels to understand that perhaps you're not as open and engaging with women philanthropists as you could be. And then fundraising strategies have been designed primarily for men over the years, and we'll talk about what that means. So there are some outdated societal views of women, right? That they're less philanthropic than men. They always defer to their husbands for charitable gift decision making, or that they don't make large gifts. So our perceptions of that just need to change, because all of these things just really aren't true. So women are likely, and often more likely, as similar situated men to give to charity. So check, right? Single female households give more than their male counterparts across income and marital status. So these trends are emerging. And baby boomers and older women are more likely to give and give more across all levels than their male counterparts. So even though the data and the trends are suggesting this shift, organizations' practices are still lagging behind. So demographics favor women in education, employment, and earnings, right? So we've seen this cultural shift over the years of women emerging, having access to wealth. And then here are just the statistics to prove or to back up what we talk about, right? So women are staying single by choice. And if they do marry, they marry much later. So, and I think that also, this is a sweeping generalization, right? So if you specifically look state by state, your marriage, your average age of marriage is probably different from the South versus the North. It's also probably different for metropolitan versus rural areas, but just know that this is an average, um, and a look across the board at what we're talking about. So if you want some more information on this, I always put, the sources where I got them at the bottom. So when we talk about women in philanthropy, um, the traditional breadwinner, like homemaker model of like the 1970s, where the dad went to work, the mom stayed home with the kids, that, like, for the most part, is pretty non-existent now. So in 41% of the households, the women is the primary breadwinner. Like, that's pretty impressive, up 30% since 1960. But remember, it's only been since 1960. So that's not very long, but a huge jump for women, right? Married women who out-earn their husbands tend to be slightly older, disproportionately white, and college educated. So there are some links. Black mothers are by far more likely to be the primary economic support for their families. And women hold 51% of managerial and professional jobs in the workforce. So you see this trend of women make their own money, right? So why shouldn't they be able to decide how they spend their money or they invest their money? And so this is also a really great point, is that women have increasing access to wealth. So technically, they will inherit twice. So number one, they're going to inherit from their parents first and foremost. And as baby boomers, start to get older and they start to die, more of this inheritance will start to come in. And then because women outlive typically their husbands, they inherit twice. So obviously, women in philanthropy, this portion doesn't take into account what it would look like in a woman and woman household, right? So keep that in mind, that of course there are biases, once again, in the reporting of this. So take it for what it's worth. But I will say that women do, regardless of their household status, represent 42% of the nation's top wealth holders. Like, that's impressive too, right? Like, we're out there, we got some money. And women are deeply involved in making decisions about their household charity, right? So typically, if there is a decision being made or discussed about how to invest your money in philanthropy, that 9 out of 10 households, the women is either the sole decision maker of how you'll invest that, or at least an equal partner. So only 10% of households rely strictly on the male to make those decisions. And when one spouse decides, the wife decides twice as often as in the household. So just some interesting trends. So here are some cool, if you like to be snoopy about who gives a lot of money, here's some cool lists to check out. The $1 million list, you can actually sort by, I think, where the donor lives, where the donor gives to, how much money. There's a lot of cool research out there that shows different information, and to save time, we won't go through that. But if you're really snooping, you want to see it, they're interesting lists to peruse through, because I think you can sort it by the biggest gifts in 2020 that were given to the state of Texas, or given to institutions in the state of Texas. And quite frankly, the biggest gifts right now are going to education. Education and healthcare are the ones that are seeing the biggest gifts come in from donors. So interesting list to check out. So when we talk about gender differences, the competitiveness comes in. And so women are much more focused on impact than outshining a peer compared to their male counterparts in their donation. And that'll come up a little bit later. And so knowing what we just sort of breezed through about leading up to why women can be philanthropists and have money and make decisions. So why do organizations still struggle, right? So top leadership, still male. So how can they get into the minds and understand how women give if they're not surrounded by any females that can help them understand that? Events tend to be tailored for men. So we think just golf. Think about all the golf tournaments that are out there. Lots of them in Texas, right? I mean, women play golf too. I get it. But if you've ever been to a golf tournament, like you may have 4 women out of, I don't know, 40 or 50 foursomes. So I attempted to play golf once. It was called How You Court Your Husband, and my golf clubs are catching dust in the closet. So one interesting thing to point out that sort of was revolutionary to my organization is that your donor databases list males as the main prospect, or what we call head of household, and you'll see HH later in the slide, and that's what that stands for, head of household. And so most databases are still predominantly set up that way, is that there has to be a primary contact followed by the secondary. And when the archaic institutions rolled into databases, they listed that male as the head of household, regardless of who the primary relationship is with. Now, there are some more forward-thinking databases out there. I know Tessitura is one of them that actually allows you to, they restructured it to have one main household where it's just sort of like the last name of the two parties, and then both individuals in the household, whether they're married or coupled or however that relationship is, can be primary relationships under that household relationship. So it's like they almost built family tree, like a family tree structure, instead of relying on one account to convey the full relationship of the household. So there is some forward movement here, but most of the time that's what you're going to see. Board recruitment tends to be male focused. Unfortunately, people seek out people like themselves because that's what they're comfortable with. And that women, when they are asked to join boards or be bigger parts of organizations, they're placed on auxiliary boards. So you're less likely to see them on executive committees or committees of high impact, of importance. So there's a lot of work to be done. So what do we do about it as fundraisers? I think number one, it's important to remember that changing a culture is challenging and it takes time. Like, this is something that it will take many, many years to fix. So you can't wait until tomorrow to make changes. But how do you know what to do to move towards a more inclusive model? And this isn't just, so what we're going to talk about in these next 3 steps, this isn't just about finding women versus men, right? How do you unearth diversity and what it should look like in your organization? So first you have to understand, what does your current donor pool look like, right? Who's making the gift? Who's it coming from, right? Number of male versus female donors. If you're keeping demographics, you can also do this. You can look at ages, you can look at zip codes, you can look at all of these types of things. And what percentage of female donors have been consistent as donors and reoccurring donors over time? So in order to understand where you're going, you have to understand where you are now. And I'll be honest with you that number one is typically the hardest thing for organizations to figure out. But once you get there, you just keep tracking it. That's my advice. So number two, you got to build the foundation for measuring impact. Like, what do you want to accomplish? There are so many goals around becoming more inclusive and more diverse in your donor pool and your giving models, right? And so there are some basic measures. You can set metrics that you want to increase the number of donors in a certain category. You can increase the total dollars raised from that category. You can increase your percentage of women on your boards. If you want to do something more advanced, you can start tracking the number of times you visit and meet and solicit diverse audiences. What are their attendance like at events? And how many times are you communicating with them your impact through stories and photos? And so in addition to that, understanding who you're serving currently, where you want to go, how you want to measure it, is you got to really understand your core stakeholders. You have to get to know, think about your core stakeholders back to that model of who's in your core, right? Major donors, staff leadership, as well as volunteer board leadership. So you really have to understand what their mentality is, because oftentimes you're going to come across people that are just resistant to change, because if change was easy, we'd do it all the time. And so understanding that if those leadership positions and those key stakeholders are not on path and not on board with developing a more inclusive model, then you have to strategically figure out how to invite them into other opportunities, right? So we don't just break up with people. That's where it comes in handy that we have term limits for board members. Term limits protect you as an organization as well as protecting a board member. It gives them an opportunity to opt out, and it gives you an opportunity to opt out of them serving on your board as well, should differences like this arise, right? So keep that in mind. So how do we appeal to women? So this is going back specifically to the data and the research. So what they like, women are highly attracted to images and diversity in images, right? They don't want to just see the same old kids. They don't want to see the same old people. They want to see that you're reaching that diverse audience. We like stories. Tell me through a story what the impact is of my gift. Provide metrics. So women, much more than men, are interested in outcomes. That doesn't mean there aren't men that aren't interested in those kinds of outcomes. But if you look at these two pools compared to each other, what you're finding is that women want more information, and they want to really be conveyed that the impact is substantial. And they're going to want you to communicate the outcomes that their philanthropy or their gift enables to happen with your organization. So how do you appeal to women? Through engagement. You got to build the relationship. Don't think transactional. So it's not just about making the ask, booking the money, sending the thank you, right? You're going to spend more time talking and getting to know women. They're much more built on relationships and trust than men are. You got to share those stories on an ongoing basis. And then you really have to have regular stewardship. In my experience as a gift officer, this is true. Like I spend more time talking and connecting to my women donors than I do to their male counterparts. So what can we do to steward women in a way that's appealing for them? So one thing that's for sure, details are important. And accuracy is imperative. If the female makes the gift, the thank you goes addressed to the female, right? If it's in a dual household income, where there's a male and a female, like don't put the male's name on there. Just because that's how it's in your database. So it's like that attention to detail is going to be critical to inviting them in and developing that relationship. And so keep a thank you a thank you. If they make a gift, you say thank you. You don't say thank you, but let's have another gift, unless they invite you into having that conversation. We had a really successful stewardship visit a few Mondays ago, where the donor at the very end of the conversation, we were going to make an ask, and we technically didn't, but the stewardship visit of touring her through the unit that her philanthropy helped launch, the hospital president said, Mary Kay, is there anything else that you wanted me to talk to you about today, or that you had hoped we had talked about? And music to my ears, the donor said, well, I don't know, Monty, is there anything you hoped we had talked about today? And I'm like, yay! So that opened the door for us to sort of float the next gift on the horizon. So if they invite you to have those conversations, take them up on it. But for the most part, this is kind of prescriptive. So, is your database helping or hurting your efforts? Once again, are the males automatically listed as head of household? Are your donors and prospects predominantly male? These are all things to ask yourself when you start to address diversity in your funders and your prospects, right? And how do we recognize women donors? It's okay to recognize them differently, right? Because they want a different type of recognition than men do. And so we're going to touch a little bit on the differences, the impact of generation and gender in philanthropy, of women donors, baby boomers versus millennials. And I found this pretty cool report. It's based in 2017. Fidelity Charitable did this sort of comparison. So this is taken right out of that report. As we start to talk about generations and giving, know that those birth years are they're kind of flexible and gray on both ends for every generation. So you have that fancy word now, which is a cusper, which means you sort of blend the lines in between two. But this this report went through and basically said, you know, baby boomers, most of their children are millennials. How do they differ? And one of the things that's important to point out, and we'll probably talk about it and I'll mention it again later, is some of these characteristics are based on what these generations have lived through, meaning the events in their life that they have witnessed. And some of these characteristics are just based on age and where you are in your life cycle, right? We know that baby boomers have much more access to wealth because they've lived longer to make more money than younger generations. So keep that in mind, that there's different reasons for different things. But some interesting things to keep in mind when we look at women boomers versus millennials is that boomers feel more strategic and confident and satisfied about their giving. Millennials tend to be more given the moment. They like to talk about and encourage their peers to give, and they're much more emotionally attached to why they give. And I will say, like, as a cusper over here in the millennial category, that's definitely me. When I see a friend needs help for something, I'm like, heck yeah. But if I want to make a bigger gift, I'm definitely doing my research and more apt to give in the meantime for an emotional reason, right? So I give through my heart much more than through strategy. Maybe that'll change eventually. Baby boomers give to fewer organizations, millennials give to many. And they are definitely millennials open to new forms of giving. So what does that mean? Baby boomers, traditional cash, check. Millennials tend to look for products that give back, like impact. We sort of talked about it in an earlier lecture. They look for impact organizations that if I buy these shoes, some money is going to go here, in addition to giving cash. So when you look at the next, when you look at the top types of organizations that they're giving to, hunger, social services are on top for both of them. However, baby boomers are more inclined next to give to healthcare research, curing diseases, of course, because they have mortality sort of staring them in the face, right? So they want to know, well, are you curing cancer? What can you do for my diabetes? What about Alzheimer's? Those types of things. While millennials want to know that that people have access to general healthcare services, right? And then, you know, access to health is in the top 3 for baby boomers, but environmental things are in the top 3 for millennials. I'm going to go to the chat. Okay, so, you know, I would say crowdfunding is definitely more appealing to younger generations, but don't think that baby boomers aren't on there too, right? You know, I think that there's a peer-to-peer and a familiarity that I think 10 years ago, let's see, my parents are in their 70s now, that 10 years ago, I would have been like mind blown if a 70-year-old was like, could navigate the world of the internet, right? And my parents are doing it. They have email accounts, which is scary, but Facebook pages, all of that, they're out there. So while you're right that I bet crowdfunding and those types of platforms are more accessible to millennials, baby boomers are still participating in them too. Um,
I think
so
it's,
go ahead.
oh, I was just gonna say it's also kind of weird to think of millennials as being someone who could be a major gift donor. Um, just putting that out there, like that is just wild to me because I feel like most of us are just trying to pay off student loans.
Amen to that, sister. I definitely we're still paying off loans in my household. But I mean, so I'm 40, I'll be 41. So I'm a cusper. I was born in 79. I sort of sit on um the cusp of Gen Xers and millennials or Gen Y. And I can see like major gift is all relative, right? Like based on where we are in our current situation, we could probably make a decent gift to an organization. But because, we've spent 20 years in the workforce now, right? So where we were even 5 years ago financially is like you start to pay off cars, you start to pay off all those things that you sort of have to buy up front. And you're you start to free up money and your focus has changed. So we're extremely blessed that we're able to give money where our interests are, and we do. So but yes, you're right that like when you start to look at who's giving the bigger pots of money, it's still really focused on those baby boomers. But there is a concern that they want to make sure that they have adequate resources through the end of their life, right? Well, if I give you that much money now, what if I get cancer tomorrow and I can't pay my medical bill? So just all things to keep in mind, which is why when I say these are great ways to profile and kind of get to know segments of the population, they're not necessarily a go-to. Um, so I will say that your millennials that are more closer to the cuspers these are the people that I would say over the next 5 or 10 years will really determine the pace of where philanthropy falls. And so some of the trends that you'll see is that you know as generations become the older generations, the one thing that is seems to be trending is that giving to religious organizations and religiously affiliated organizations has always been top of the list. It's now trending lower and lower, so people are realizing that there's other needs out there to make bigger impacts. So I think those are the types of things that you will see. So if you look at women versus men, women tend to be more spontaneous, engaged in their giving, and empathetic to high impact type of story. They prefer to look for advice from experts in the field versus their male counterparts who like to get advice from personal contacts, sort of in their peer network. Men typically have a giving strategy compared to women. That's not to say that women aren't strategic in their giving. These are just the trends. And women are more likely than men to have questions about the finances of giving, like how men seem to understand all the different strategies that you can set up, like the trusts and whether they're irrevocable or non-revocable, the planned giving, as well as, how to take advantage of the tax laws as they're written. Seems to be an area of difference for women versus men. So if you're interested, again, to read that full report, like I said, it's 2017. It's only 3 years old, but it's getting to the point where maybe it's a little outdated and trends have hopefully shifted. So check it out. Oh, this is my favorite part of the lecture. Giving in the LGBTQ plus community. Fundraising within this community is no different than fundraising among any other groups of individuals. So as you probably read, the outdated chapter that talks all about, that bases everything off of the AIDS crisis in California, you probably came to realize just how dated and how far we've come in the society. So what I will say is keep that in mind. Like, people are people across the board, right? Get to know what they're interested in. The one thing that the text does sort of call attention to is that this group tends to be just more impassioned about why they give and where they give than any of the other groups. So, I mean, this is pretty much my slide. If anybody has any questions, I mean, that's just how I feel about it. Like, there's a lot of studies out there, but it can only trend us to think about people in segments that maybe we don't need to think about them in. So people are people, get to know them. They all have their passions and their reasons. So faith in giving. Woo! So some of the interesting things that when we talk about religious giving is that religious giving does make up, if you think back to that Giving USA sort of slide and how it breaks down, is that religious giving has and probably will continue probably for the next 5 to 10 years, maybe not 10, to make up the largest portion of contributions of charitable giving. So right now it's at 29%. It was trending down, but it trended back up this past year. So just something to keep watch over. So local congregations and houses of worship, they do make up the overwhelming majority of religious giving. However, it's important to note that the religious sector doesn't quite look like that pie where individuals give, 68 to 72%, followed by foundations, followed by bequests, followed by which one did I just leave out? Corporations, because they give less than dead people. They tend to be more heavily reliant on individual giving, right? There's not a lot of grants out there that houses of worship can apply for. And so when we think about religious giving, is that we sort of have to expand that to think about what we call religious identified or religiously affiliated organization. And so these are organizations who, while may not be churches or houses of worship, they've identified themselves as being part of a specific religion or faith. So the best one that I can think of is like the Jewish Federation, Catholic Charities, those types of organizations, which aren't necessarily the church, but an affiliated arm, right? And so if you look at congregations alone, 41% of giving, or 41% of Americans give to those types of congregations. Now, if you add in these RIOs, these religiously identified organizations, there's an additional 32%, right? Which means that 73% are giving to either religious organizations or these religiously affiliated organizations. That's a monstrosity. Like, that's a lot of people. And so what they have done is looked at what are the ties between religiosity and giving. So people who report that religion is important, they give more than those who claim religious is not important. And so what I would be interested in is, as the trend becomes, as people disconnect, probably not even the right way to say it, as generational movement just naturally happens and generations become less connected to religion, or have it placed less high as a whole on their giving priorities, how these trends will change, right? Studies show that higher levels of an individual religiosity leads to higher rate of giving. both in religious and non-religious. So they're not just religious and giving to that religious organization that they love so dearly. They're also giving to non-religious organization. But a large portion of all of this giving is going to congregations and religiously identified organizations. So obstacles. So when you're working with individuals who are highly religious or are very connected to their faith, the obstacles that you often have to overcome is that there's this perception of never having enough financial resources. And so often, while they have the capacity and they have the resources, what the data has found and the trends have shown is that they have a perception that they don't have enough. And so there is sort of a giving illiteracy. Like, so what does that mean? What is the standard of generosity? They don't understand what major gifts are because they have just come to know that you give, you tithe a certain percentage of your income every month or every year. And so, and some people give because they feel guilty. They feel guilty that they're not giving to support congregations and organizations. And so if you, in fact, there can be fundraising for religious organizations. So if you want to step into that realm with your church or your faith or your congregation, that just know that these could possibly be some barriers or obstacles for you encouraging people to give. So questions, comments? Oh, there's a question in the chat. Okay, so Zoomers, is that like the quick flip way to refer to Generation Z, JJ?
Yeah,
I have not heard that term.
I think it's 1998 is the birth year for Zoomers, or 97.
Okay.
Yeah,
The
it was
cousin is
just
22. I think he says his job. Yeah, absolutely. And so it's interesting as you start to think about, and we'll talk a little bit more about it after we take a little break, is that yeah, what are the trends? Like, what are these profiles of these generations look like, and how will that impact where and how they give? Yeah, I sat through this really great lecture by the Greater Houston Community Foundation, who did it through AFP, and they asked us all to write down significant events that we have witnessed in our lifetime. And it will play to sort of what we talk about a little bit later, but just thinking about the diversity, there were like some people were alive during Watergate, some people were alive during significant impacts like Challenger, the Challenger explosion. Think about those great impact things that your parents lived through, like the Great Depression, right? How does that inform your giving and how you live? Or today, like all the things that we're living through now. It is definitely, like, without a doubt, what we're living through today will impact a lot of things, and how people give and how people spend their time and resources on both sides, right? It is identified very passionate people for very different reasons. So, okay. Questions? Take a quick break. I have it 6:35. Do we want to come back at, let's say, 6:41, so we get like a full 5 minutes? And then we have 2 short sections. I say short, but just a few more sections on demographics and generations. So, yay. Bathroom break. Woo! All right, see y'all in 5. Uh-oh, somebody, oh, Alrighty. During the break, did we think of any awesome questions you wanted to ask? I see we are all so engaged with this conversation. My mom is reporting that her dog has Cushing's disease. Yes. So if you wonder what that is, because I had to Google it, it is cortisol level, but it can be managed through meds. So there you go. She has like a giant, she said she got a Labradoodle, but this thing is like Great Dane big. Lily of Simple Mind. But there you go. She's in better spirits. All right, friends. So let's talk about ethnic diversity and how that informs giving. So if we go to the US Census, oh, I got a question in the chat. Yes, I don't think I paused it. So if you go back to look at the break or the recording, you're gonna have to fast forward through 5 minutes of us taking a break. So yes. All right, so 4 out of 10 individuals identify as a race other than non-Hispanic white. The trend is still as follows, that the US will become a majority minority nation sometime between in the next 21 to 26 years, basically. So that doesn't seem very far off, but it definitely, well, if I'm lucky, it'll still be in my lifetime. But yes, it'll be fun to see. So what we do know is ethnic and racial identity does influence philanthropic behavior for many reasons. And what do we know is that Asian households gave to charity at the highest rate. 71% of Asian households give, right? So what we know is it's maybe culturally ingrained in something that they've been brought up to understand or know that it's important in different ways than others. Non-minority households, 65%, Hispanics and African Americans come in the 45%. But some interesting data is that when you account for the differences in income, education, and socioeconomic situations, we're showing no significant difference between ethnic groups. So what else do we know about giving differences? Is that some ethnic group prioritize places of worship higher than others. I probably should put those in order. Sorry about that. Spontaneous giving. African American communities and Hispanics tend to be more spontaneous, and Asian Americans tend to do much more research before they give. So something that is important to point out is that ethnicity doesn't determine the likelihood of giving or the amount that they give, but it will influence the way which donors think about philanthropy and their giving priorities, right? And so when we talk about ethnicity and giving, there are tendencies to keep giving within those ethnic groups like they've always been taught to think. So when organizations set out to reach into underserved communities and provide programs to them, and then in turn look for participation through philanthropy, they're not as likely to find it because it's hard for individuals who have been doing something all of their life or have been brought up to do something a certain way. It's hard for them to sort of break that pattern. Language barriers often exist. Think about how many organizations out there are just now starting to put out material in Spanish, right? How many organizations are just now starting to recognize that if you want to communicate with a community, you meet them where they are, not expect them to come where you are, right? And it's about building trust. You got to get, especially as a gift officer, community ethnic diversity alone, but building trust in a community in general is hard, and it takes time. And it takes a lot of consistency. So And sometimes when you think about ethnic diverse groups is that they have difficult agreeing on community objectives. So many of them sort of work in groups, and what the group finds important, they sort of all go with, is what data suggests. So what can we as fundraisers do? Um, you have to help the community themselves identify what's important to them and be mindful of the small nuances. I mean, it's about emotional intelligence. It's about getting to know a community. It's about getting to know individual donors and bringing them things based on what you've learned about their interests, and vision for philanthropy are, versus putting them in a box with everybody else and assuming that's how they'll give based on where they live, how they learn, look, and what their background is. So, I mean, at the end of the day, people are people, and you still have to have these conversations and get to know people. But this does help empower us as fundraisers to make better decisions and be better informed about how to approach certain groups. So you've got to promote inclusion, right? Your organization can't be known for only serving a non-Hispanic white community and expect to be welcome in to all of these other communities with open arms, right? So what can you do? Welcome them into your community by providing access to volunteer opportunities that match how they want to be impactful, right? What can they do to help? Identify projects that appeal to specific groups. None of this should be surprising as how you can promote inclusion, because it's how we promote inclusion across the board. Or I would, with a non-Hispanic white donor, definitely identify projects that appeal to them. So why wouldn't I do it with any other group or any other individual? So build trust through social networks and engagement. Try and find spokespersons in the community that you're trying to reach to, that are sort of like icons. That's probably not even the right word, but someone that in that community that others look up to. Is it a successful business person? Is it somebody who's high up in their church or their place of faith? And diversify your leadership, right? If you really want to understand how to approach different groups, then put those people in your core stakeholder group yourself. Questions about ethnic diversity? No? Nothing? Cool. All right, so generational differences in giving. I find like this is the fun conversation, because as this class progresses and each year I teach it, like, of course, I get older and older, but the group of students becomes just more diverse age-wise. So we often span maybe 3 generations. We have before, so interesting. So I'm excited. So let's talk about generational giving. So remember, there are some people, I still think that there's some people out there that were born in the generations in the before boomers, but we refer to them as matures if they were born 1945 or earlier. There's some really seasoned individuals out there that could possibly potentially give to your organization. But for the purposes of this, yes, see, Caitlin has, like, her great grandmother is 100. That is incredible. They're out there, man. Tell me what she ate to live to be 100, man. Crazy. Yeah, no kidding. Happy birthday to her. So when we vaguely talk about generations, this is about estimated of what we're talking about. So just remember, Generation Z, those folks are like 19 and 20. So that's crazy. Blows my mind. Anyway, so, I got a lot more chats. Lots of happy birthdays. Excellent. Okay, so let's talk about before boomers. 1945 or earlier, they lived through the Great Depression, right? when they coming up and their upbringing, their structures of their family typically included that extended family, right? So they had aunts and uncles and grandparents all living in one roof. Why? Because funds were slim. Now, that's not abnormal now for people who live with in impoverished communities, right? It's multi-generational households, can also be a cultural thing as well as a financial reason. So keep that in mind. When they grew up, mass productions of televisions, telephones, home appliances, and automobiles were just starting. And we're not talking about like smartphone computers that we hold, like those old school cord telephones that you used to like circle and dial, like not even the little touch ones. So they are really first starting to see technology play a larger role if you could even afford it, right? Most of their social relationships, so where do they meet people? Schools, congregations, communities of faith, and neighborhood associations. And so characteristics, when we think about the before boomer generation, we think about loyalty, hard work, devotion to work. They really just respect authority and work towards a common good. So these are the people who started at a company and 50 years later retired from that company. Many of them maybe not seeing any upward mobility, but that's just what you did. You found good work, they gave you a chance, you stuck with it, and that was their idea of how to be a good worker and provide for your family. So we skip to the next generation, if I can figure out how to turn these, to the boomers. So boomers are still very much alive and out there, right? So when we look at their family structures, they were mostly nuclear. So by the time boomers had grown up, the impact of living in such a chaotic, large household with multi-generations was they shifted gear, and it was just them, their spouse or partner, and their children if they had it, right? So boomers grew up in a post-World War II era, the civil rights movement. I mean, think about that. Mind-blowing that that wasn't that long ago. And so space exploration for the first time, right? They saw Buzz Aldrin land on the moon. They lived through the Cold War and the Vietnam War. Televisions became more important to them. Their peer groups were important to their social and cultural development. So as televisions became more affordable, more people watched it, you saw the emergence of sort of late night talk show hosts, the ability to be more informed outside of the newspaper about what was going on in the world, but still pretty much a national perspective versus international. There was a sense of financial security that allowed them to be innovative with ideas and protest inequalities, right? And so when we think about the characteristics of boomers, they're hopeful, they're optimistic, they have a value of youth, and material wealth was important to them, and health. So all of these things is like, as you think about the characteristics that make up sort of the generalizations of what we think about when we talk about each one of these generations, it's very much so dependent on what they lived through as a generation. So Generation X's, most of these individuals right now are the ones that are really starting to take over companies, right? The boomers are now starting to retire. Now that there's a little more stability in the stock market compared to 5 or 6 years ago, but they're starting to, Generation Xers are starting to take over those high-level C-suite management positions. So once again, that family structure stayed very nuclear. They're living in the post-civil rights movement. They did live during Watergate and the scandal, the Watergate scandal and the Vietnam War. So once again, there was a war that impacted their generation. This is the first generation that grew up with a significantly high rate of divorced parents. So this is where you start to see the emergence of single household parents. And what we know statistically is that more often than not, it was the mother who raised the children versus the father. So um, there is social support through interaction with peers and mass media. Um, this was the first generation to adapt to technology. So here, personal computers and the internet, they were well into probably their 30s and 40s before this stuff became really accessible. I remember my dad was a dentist, and he brought home, he's not a Generation X, but he's a baby boomer. But I remember we didn't get our first computer until probably, I just remember playing like old computer games on it and doing nothing of importance. But, I probably didn't get one until, I don't know, middle school. I remember still typing research papers or typing papers for middle school on typewriters. So, yeah, I don't think I had my first cell phone until I went to college, which is mind blowing. Like, if I think about it, that it really hasn't been that long ago, but it feels like forever ago. So this is the generation where diversity and equality seems a little more normal. But I think that saying that it is the norm would be underplaying the fact that diversity and equality still doesn't exist today. So keep that in mind. So characteristics of this generation. This is really the generation that wants that balance between work and life. They want meaningful work. They want an appropriate salary. They recognize that they're not going to work 60 to 80 hours every week, and they don't expect to be paid for that type of work, but yet they still want to be recognized for the value that they bring financially. They want to be recognized financially for the value that they bring to an organization. So they're equally concerned with that, but they also want free time and opportunities for fun. So it's like they didn't find jobs that they were impassioned about making a difference. They found jobs that paid a reasonable amount of money, that gave them balance between work and life, and their job was a means to do what they loved. And so that sort of changes with millennials and later generations. So here, millennials, as of right now, although Gen Zs will probably outpace them, is that they're the most educated, technologically advanced, and racially, ethnically diverse generation in history. So that will probably change, which I would assume it is, if we think about the statistic of the majority minority coming to fruition in the next 20 years. Millennials have only known the world with advanced technology. And I would say that's probably mid to late millennials as opposed to the older millennials in that generation. Because of the advanced technology, there was increased access to global information, right? We could see now what was happening internationally. It was no longer just what was happening nationally or locally. And so this is where you start to get, it makes absolutely perfect sense that millennials and younger generation have much more of a passion to give internationally with their giving, right? Because they're more aware, they're more attuned with it, they have an understanding of what's going on in the world at any given time. Healthy and active lifestyles are important here. And when we think about their characteristics, fiercely loyal, work ethic is similar to boomers, right? So funny, because the boomers always refer to millennials as like pretty much snowflakes, right? It's sort of millennials and earlier can be, which is so funny because also millennials have now that flip saying of okay boomer, but yet they're so similar, right? They're both loyal, they both have fantastic work ethic, even though millennials have been called lazy, egocentric, all of those types of things. But they now are even more savvy with technology than their previous generation. So I find millennials are fascinating. I feel like they're coming up. They're taking over the world. So here we've got sort of this Generation Z. Um, so here we go. They are most or more racially and ethnically diverse than any other generation, sort of outpacing our millennials. They're on track to be the most well-educated generation. They have little to no memory of the world before smartphones, right? It blew my mind that my second grader was learning cursive. I mean, do you think he'll ever write? I mean, I don't know. And so, of course, when we think about Generation D, financially focused, entrepreneurial, like there's a hustle out there that exists for them. That's, I should say, there's a hustle out there that has to happen that's forced upon this generation. Why? Because of just the world that we're living in today. Um, uh, there's just not the jobs out there that existed when they went into college, so they're going back to college. I don't know how many of y'all end up in this generation, but there's a lot of things that have happened that influence those characteristics. They're more flexible, they welcome change, they're entrepreneurial. Chances are they're not working jobs that have benefits in any way. You know what? If I had to read my dad's cursive, I couldn't either. But yes, I thought it had gone away, but for real. Okay, so there's just sort of the generational overview as we go forward and talk about, so how does this influence giving? So it's important to talk about median household income, right? Who has the most money and how many people are there? My sources are down here on the bottom if you're interested in learning more. But, you know, boomers are getting smaller. And so obviously the before boomers are getting really small. However, there's still 20.78 million before boomers. There's still over 100, well, I guess not 70, 80, 90, close to 100 million boomers and before boomers out there. But what you'll notice is the average household income sort of tracks about the same for boomers, Gen X's, and millennials. So, right, it's all in that 71 to $77,000 range, or 70. Of course, we don't have, I should fix that, sorry. Generation Z information about household income, because really it's probably insignificant at this point, that very few Generation Z, we just don't understand their giving patterns yet. But based on what they're living through, we could predict where we think they will be giving. So that brings us to this cohort versus lifestyle effect. So what we're talking about is there's two things that as we went through and we profiled all these generations, and we sort of talk about you know, cultures that you grow up in and how you grow up and where you grow up, all of this has an impact and an influence on your interests and values and how you determine you want to spend your money. Okay, so the cohort effect is the influence of historical experience, right, on the outcome of data. So it's what you've lived through, things you can't change. That's just what you've lived through, how it is, and your perception of what happened during those historical experiences forms your mind and your thinking and your thoughts as an adult. Now there's the lifestyle effect that says your interests and your values and your priorities and your opinions may change over time. And what it does is it parallels. So the lifestyle effect means at any given time in your life, what is important to you and why. So what I can tell you is before I was married, my activities, my interests and values, way different. Then I got married, that sort of shifted. I mean, I still had the same interests, but priorities have to shift, right? It was not just about me anymore. Now about my spouse and me. And then, you know, we used to do a lot more going to, well, COVID-19 aside, but we used to do a lot more, like we went to restaurants more often. We bought tickets to things more often. Then we had kids, right? And you're sort of in the dark ages because you can't really afford to do all of that because babysitters are expensive. So our priorities have shifted, and now instead of buying memberships based on just two individuals, we now look at organizations that appeal to the family. So we have Zoom memberships, right? We have Museum of Natural Science membership. We are giving priorities are to where our children go to school. However, at some point, my children are going to grow up and we're no longer going to have the need for the Zoom membership. And those values and priorities continue to shift based on what we want in life, right? And so both of these play a part in how people give and how people perceive their giving to be an impact. So across generations, that being said, there are the top 5 causes have been identified. So local social service organizations are up there on the top, places of worship, health charities, those could be hospitals, or those could be charities that support hospitals like research foundations, American Heart Association, those types of places, children's charities, and education focused. There are also different ways to engage donors throughout the spectrum of generation. And by engagement, I mean, how are they making their gifts, right? Still, the principal form for older generations is to make a monetary donation, aka cash donation, right? Cash donation does mean credit card. It does mean writing a check, because often they still will. But that is still the principal form for older generations. Some people donate goods. Some people are more likely to clean out their cabinets every time the food bank needs money, or every time they need donations, and take a big box of canned goods down to the store. You can also engage people. Lots of people visit your charity's websites, right? What are you doing? How are you engaging them? What's on there? Most people will say that they visited a charity's website before they made a gift. So it definitely is something to keep in mind. And then volunteering for younger generation. Obviously, because they have less access to financial resources, they're giving more of their time than they are of their treasure. Let me just go backwards. Okay, so when we talk about motivations for giving, what do we know about the before boomers? They're retired or they're working part-time to just keep in the game. They're very loyal to organizations. So chances are they have determined what organizations they are going to give to from now until the end of their life. But it's still important to note that 26% of all donations come from this group. And 60% of all boomers are giving to their place of worship. So we know they heavily support emergency relief, troops and veterans things. You're going to find your arts and advocacy folks come from here, as well as big donations to election campaigns. They give through cash, and they are often the people that are going to still mail you a check. And I know this comes as no surprise, but they are the least likely group to donate online. So then you have your boomers, right? 43% of them give all monetary donations, while 48% of all boomers have noted that they have volunteered at an organization. About half of them give to their place of worship, and that half of them want to know about the organization's finances before they give. So something important to note is, like, still we're seeing the trends. Like, before boomers, they were really just sort of trusting of the organization. They felt passionate about the causes that they were supporting, and because they felt passionate equated to trust for them, and so they didn't question how the organization was spending money, right? However, the trend is shifting. It's shifting into that more accountability requirement from donors for organization. So top supporters of first responders, like the people that are giving to first responders, those are the boomers of all generations. 60% cash, and then what we're seeing is they're also providing those in-kind goods and services here as well. You will see boomers more likely to give at checkout donations. So, you know, at Target, when they're like, hey, you want to round up? I think I saw that at CVS the other day. They asked me if I wanted to round up my donation. Um, they are giving online, so don't forget about them. They are on the interweb. And they often give in honor of, which is the IHO, in honor of, or tribute gifts. Why? Because it is their friends and their colleagues and their peer groups that are now passing away, and they're giving in honor of them or in tribute to them or in tribute to individuals at organizations. So this is that the generation that's most likely to make those gifts. That doesn't mean any of the other generations are not. It just those are the trends with baby boomers. So Gen X, they give 20% of all monetary donations. You'll notice that we went from 50s of giving to the place of worship with baby boomers to now dropping off to high 30s, 38 place of worship. 9% donate to human rights causes. So you're seeing the trends come away from religious places of organization or worship and move more towards human rights, civil rights, and equality. They are the top supporters of health services, and animal rights too, human and animal rights, and environment protection here. So you're seeing sort of the same demographics, 66% cash, 30% give goods, and you're also going to see them giving at checkout donations, purchase of proceeds, and giving online. So sort of giving in that message or giving in that mechanism of buying something that gives back to the community. So like holding, much more so today, I think the trend has been holding organizations, or I should say companies, more accountable for their role in perpetuating a good society. So you're seeing Gen X call account to that. However, it's not really until the millennials and Gen Z that you're really seeing that push and that accountability. So while millennials are only giving 11% of all monetary donations, they are the group to watch, right? In the next 5 to 10 years, the accumulation of wealth that they're going to have. Why? Because they're going to inherit twice, once from their parents, so that all that money is going to shift and change hands. So you're going to see this. I suspect that millennials will outpace Gen Xers in philanthropy, is my bet. And so 32% give to their place of worship, down from 38%. So you're still seeing it trend downward. However, the reason why religion is still top of the list is because of the disproportionate amount boomers and before boomers are giving, right? Human rights are important, international development, child development, and victims of crime and abuse are all top of the list for millennial donors as a group. 50% cash, 34% volunteering. So you're not really seeing goods being given anymore. You're seeing now volunteering has outpaced giving sort of in-kind donation. Once again, they're comfortable giving during checkout donations, they give online, and purchase of those proceed products. And so Generation Z, I mean, 30% have already donated to an organization, and these are probably slightly outdated numbers. I suspect that it's probably a little bit higher, and election years probably impact that. Generation Z prefer mobile apps for giving, right? Make sure your organization is up on being like it works with every kind of device. I can't tell you how frustrating, you probably know this, when you go onto some organization's website and when you're trying to scroll through and do something, it's not readjusting for your screen, or the drop down menus are not working. And just think about how frustrated you are and make sure that like invest your money there. Because these are your future donors. By 2020, here we go, they'll make up 40% of all customers. They have a big impact in how the market trends happen, right? 60% want their work to make a difference. So now you're getting back to that trend of where the boomers were. They're passionate about what they want to do and make a difference. Their work is their life, is their source of happiness, all encompassing. And 76% are worried about the planet. So environmental causes are really important to this generation. And I don't think that is because of the age. I don't think that that's something that generation will grow out of. I think that they will continue to be very mindful of the planet and giving back. Yeah, I don't think that's an age thing. So just as you think about that, you know, so how does that inform how we engage with generation? You know, younger generations tend to like event style fundraising better, right? It's social for them. You know, some tickets tend to be a little more affordable. They're more willing to spend a little more money if they're getting something out of it, like they're getting an experience. So issue-based fundraising with the younger generations is very important, right? Telling people how the cause will help or change someone's life for the better is really important to convey, and it's really important for organizations to get good at conveying, right? It's no longer impactful to say arts for art's sake. You know, some of the other impact phrases that are a little outdated are our ticket costs, our ticket revenue only covers X% of our total operating. So that's a little outdated. So what are the new impact statements that are going to make people understand why what we do in the arts is important? So smaller actions, what we've noticed is that there's impulsiveness and an immediacy to gratification that organizations have to figure out how to capture, right? How can you be in the right place at the right time? COVID is a really great example for organizations that were able to get out there and get their message out about how it was impactful at the time when most people were starting to understand what that impact meant, were the ones that brought in the most donations, right? They were also the ones that were the most immediate and the first in the market to say, we're doing this. This is how we're making a difference. So being able to feed into that impulsive nature, because when people see people hurting or being impacted by something, they want to make a difference. And even though we can't physically go somewhere, can we financially help? You always feel better when you give money. And so using networks as assets and as voices in addition to money, like who can advocate for you? Not in a political type way, but who can be a voice in a community for you that you're trying to reach? Look for those people. That's how you can use different generations. And look to blend personal and professional interests, right? So we know that as the generations become younger, or I should say the newer generations, as they're emerging into philanthropists and donors, we know that they're passionate about the work that they do because it has often that they have been attracted or focused on something where they want to make a difference. And so knowing where you find those individuals, where do they hang out? Where do the Gen Zers hang out that find the arts to be really important? Can you find a network or a voice that can help you in messaging the greater constituency of that group? So all good tactics to think about. So as we think about sort of what we talked about today, you can easily go into creating subgroups of subgroups of subgroups and like drive yourself batty. So you can easily say, okay, well, we're going to take men and women and split them differently. But now we're going to look at Asian Americans and Black Americans and white American women But then we're going to look at how they're different, not only by gender, but ethnicity, but now generationally. And all of a sudden, you've created 9 different campaigns and 9 different tactics. And so we use this to inform how we can reach out to diversify our donor pool. And so instead of looking internally and saying, well, this is how we should be communicating with people that are already communicating, step back and think about the conversation that we had earlier about identifying diversity, setting your goals for the group you want to reach, and then using all of this data to inform how you better engage them, right? How can you communicate with those generations, with those ethnic groups? How can you communicate with people that are different than yourself and have those communications be impactful, timely, and on point, so you can get those donors or future donors to give back to your organization. So that's how we use all of this data, because you can easily, it helps you assess, I think, also when you have campaigns that have flopped. What do we know about who we were mailing to? What do we know about who we were emailing to? Did we send a message over email that's more fitting to boomers and expect a different response? So use this not as a way to define your fundraising practices, but a way to inform what you're doing and your plans to be more impactful. Questions, comments? Because really all we have are like key takeaways at this point.
I think that identity politics is a really important element of, I would definitely say, of the millennial generation and the present time, but it was reminding me of a lecture that I heard when I was an undergrad. I took a class with a guy who's a really good musicologist. He loves pop music. He was talking about Hips Don't Lie by Shakira, which is a great song, by the way. Great, phenomenal. But he was talking about how it's a really good example of cultural integration, and how there's a lot of pride in that song and those lyrics, which maybe even 10 years before that song came out would be really unusual. And I think that that would definitely play into fundraising as well, that things that were culturally unusual or considered very foreign, that barrier is really, in 2020 at least, very blurred now, and will continue to get blurred, I think, for the better.
Yeah, hopefully. Absolutely. I think as younger generations, where it is much more of a norm for them as they progress in their life journeys, it definitely will carry with them. So what generations are talking about 40 years from now, who knows, right? It'll be interesting. Okay, Demetria. Oh, were we still talking about cursive writing? Is that what? Is that okay? I'm moving back. Any other thoughts about demographics? What did you think of the text? I mean, I unfairly projected what I felt about it on you, but what did you guys feel about it?
I thought it was interesting seeing the demographic. Like, I could tell it was a little outdated, but I didn't think the book was that old either. So I was surprised to see it felt like some stereotypes were applied to certain demographics.
Yeah, isn't that funny how I read sort of into that too, how that author's perspective, he didn't let the data speak for itself. He forced his own perspective in how he discussed it. So,
yeah,
and you're right.
He definitely had like a thesis, like this is
an
why
agenda.
The numbers say this. Yeah, like an agenda. I'm always just really fascinated by breakdowns of numbers, and when like demographic groups are kind of tracked that way. But yeah, it has a tendency to be very skewed by the person collecting the information. So you have
Yeah,
to,
absolutely. Absolutely. So that's why I typically try to go out and look for the most trending sources out there. And unfortunately, like there's not a lot of people right now in this temperature of what we deal with on a daily basis who are willing to write those types of insights. And so that's why when I saw those diverse panels, those diversity panels come out, like tell me what I need to know, right? How awesome is that? And so timely. So once again, I encourage y'all to sit on those and get to know what people think and how they think you should do it, because if we were doing it right, we wouldn't be having those panels. So there's always ways to learn and there's always ways to engage. So other thoughts? Nothing, huh? Okay. Then if you do not have, I'll say one more thing, because I'm like reminding myself after class, I'm going to go update the draft, the peer review for the corporate grant application and extend it. And so hopefully no one has turned in their paper, so I can still do that. But I'll extend it. But please keep in mind, if you turn one in, go in and do a peer evaluation. And you go right back into where you submitted your paper to find all of that information. So if you have issues, some folks have successfully navigated that. So if you as a peer, yes, that is correct, JJ. I'm confirming I'm extending the peer review to Monday at 11:59 p.m. So you basically have all day of Monday, because I know some people, and I didn't take this into consideration, like the weekend is my downtime. So I'm always like, that's when I'm doing my stuff. But some people work all weekend. So just to be mindful of that. But do, like, if you turn something in, go in and review somebody else's. So, and I will say, if anybody in the chat feels really confident about how you navigate, turn it in, and would welcome helping a peer in the class navigate it if they're having problems, go ahead and put it in the chat, and so people know who they can reach out to if they can't find things. Because as an instructor, I have a different view than everybody, and so I'm not always the best source to help you figure out how to do it. So so if you're interested in being sort of a peer support, CC, thank you, you're awesome. But if you don't have any questions, y'all are welcome to sign off. I am officially going to stop recording.